Juneteenth celebration. My name is Allison Ryder, and I'm the board secretary of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And I, again, want to thank you and welcome you to our third event for our 2021 series. I know that yesterday, actually on Thursday, President Biden officially made Juneteenth a federal holiday, but it's been many, many years now that the Black Heritage Trail has been celebrating Juneteenth. I remember 4 years ago sitting in the basement of a church with beautiful community surrounding me. And I know COVID makes us have to be virtual this year, but I remember so much, and I know next year we're going to work really hard to be back in person. Not only is there something beautiful about the camaraderie of community, but the food. I tell you, I learned that I adore collard greens. I adore so much of things that I was never exposed to, having lived and grown up here in New Hampshire. And that is the gift that the Black Heritage Trail offers. It offers a chance not only to explore Black history, but for me as a white person to explore my own history. And so today's event, Art of the Story, exploring how DNA powers a changing narrative, is an incredible discussion that talks about the role the new science is playing in presenting a more complete story of our country, the dangers inherent in the new science, and the power of the story to aid in individual and collective healing. I say all that because one of the most powerful tools we use to keep oppression or keep segregation alive is by ensuring that history is erased. And again, that is the power of what the Black Heritage Trail is here to offer all of us. But before we get going, there's some important items to cover. First, we'd like to do a land acknowledgement statement. The Black Heritage Trail New Hampshire acknowledges that we are on the traditional lands and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge with honor and gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations, both in our past and especially through our present today. Without their stewardship, we would not be here. So thank you for that. In addition, we have some amazing sponsors that we would like to thank for their support. First of all, I want to thank all of you. Without audience, without engagement, without participation, these events would not be possible. But we also have amazing community sponsors: Eastern Bank, The Fabulous Fine, Revision Energy, University of New Hampshire, Centrist Digital, People's United, the Music Hall, and the Seacoast African American Cultural Center. And I must say, since I was in that basement 4 years ago, this list has grown substantially. And the members of the audience who were there then, we thank you for your continued support. And for those who are new today, we thank you for your engagement. I'd like to turn it over to Terry for some quick housekeeping items.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this amazing panel that we have for you today. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that everyone knows kind of the rules of Zoom. And so what we ask is that during the panel, each presenter, we ask that you keep your mics muted so that we don't get any feedback or any background noise from you all. During that time, you can put questions that you may have in the chat. If you have a question for a presenter, please preference it at the end with Q&A. If you have a question on a technical thing, you can preference it with IT, and one of our staff members will help you and will direct message you and help you solve your problem. All of the questions will be fielded by a moderator, Dr. Shari Robinson. And we hope that you have a great time with this panel, and we hope that you get as much information as you possibly can. So thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Good morning, everybody. I am so excited for this program. And as Allison said a few minutes ago, I am so excited that, you know, we're that as a country, as a nation, that we are publicly acknowledging the significance of Juneteenth. So we have an outstanding list of panelists. So first, let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Shari Robinson, and I am the Assistant Vice Provost for Student Life at the University of New Hampshire. I just jumped right into it because I'm like so excited for our program this morning. And I have the distinct honor of introducing our 4 panelists and just moderating the questions and making sure that we stay on time and just engaging us in what's going to be a very stimulating and dynamic discussion this morning. So our first panelist, and we'll go in the order that I'm introducing our illustrious panelist, is Elon Cook. She'll begin the program. She's a public historian, educator, curator, and museum activist and genealogist. She seeks to engage the public with challenging historical narratives, to open your hearts and to change minds, one conversation at a time. And we know that's going to happen in today's event. She's with the National Association for Interpretation. She's a certified workshop developer and instructor. She has trained hundreds of historic sites, interpreters, and museum professionals across the country on interpretation theory and the development of slavery programs that center Black humanity and incorporates anti-oppression framework into museum work. What a heavy hitter. Our next panelist is Daniel Horowitz. He's dedicated to genealogy since 1986. He was the teacher and the study guide editor of the Family History Project, Searching for My Roots in Venezuela for 15 years. He was a board member of the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies for 10 years, and now is involved in several crowdsourced digitalization and transcription projects, and holds a board level position at the Israel Genealogy Research Association. This is actually, I consider this an international event because Daniel is actually joining us from Israel. And as such, because of the time difference, he will have to leave immediately following his presentation. So if you have specific questions addressed to Daniel about his presentation, drop them in the chat and we'll incorporate those questions as part of his 15-minute presentation. Our next dynamic panelist is Sherman McRae, is an experienced genealogist specializing in African-American genetic genealogy and research, primarily within the Carolinas, and serves as co-admin on the A-YDNA haplogroup project. He has a special interest in the genetic and scientific advancement of Africans and the people of the diaspora in hopes of bridging the genetic divide and discovering new haplogroups that exist in undertested populations. I'm sure we're going to learn about what haplogroups are during Sherman's presentation. Last but not least is Dr. Reynaldo Anderson, currently serves as the Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Harris-Stowe State University in St. Louis, Missouri. Reynaldo is currently the Executive Director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, an international network of artists, intellectual creatives, and activists. He is also a published author and co-editor of several anthologies and journals. Wow. Did I not say that we have an illustrious group of panelists? I mean, we definitely have some heavy hitters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Elon to start our presentations. Elon, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful warm welcome. And also thank you to the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail for inviting me to come and speak. Just gonna get my slides up. There we go. So I also wanna say a big happy Juneteenth to everyone all across the country and those folks joining us from other parts of the world. I'm really just so glad to see everyone here this morning, spending your Juneteenth wisely, coming here to join us to have an opportunity to learn some new perspectives and histories, and maybe even picking up some genetic genealogy research skills. So this morning, I was asked to talk about the power of storytelling and its ability to aid in individual and even collective healing. So I thought I would actually start off by telling you all a few stories. Now, I've got like a lot of different slides, so I'm going to zoom through some of them, but I'm happy to answer more questions, go into more details once we get to our Q&A. And definitely, like Shari said, please make sure you put some questions in the chat, and I'd love to just jump into those when we get to that point. So first, as you know, today is an incredibly important day in our nation's history. This is the first time that we can all celebrate Juneteenth as a federally recognized holiday, just as our first speaker mentioned. Now, what that really means to each of you, or even to this country, remains to be seen. Anytime you try to create something amazing, especially when you do it at the kind of the last minute, you're bound to run into unforeseen problems and all kinds of questions. So what should millions of people do with their suddenly declared new day off from work? So on June 19th of 1865, Major General Gordon Granger told the newly free people of Galveston, Texas, that they were advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages paid by their former enslavers, now their employers, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So Black people were free, and according to Granger, they could now enjoy absolute equality of personal rights and rights to property. But they could not do that they could not really do as they pleased, when they pleased, or where they pleased. They were advised not to move from the places they had been forced to reside in and travel the countryside in search of their beloved kin. There would be no funding made available to support them for a day off, a period of paid leave, just to relax, spend time with their loved ones, and spend some much needed time considering what it actually would mean to be free. Making plans for the future, maybe even crafting a 19th century version of a vision board, no, that was not the advisable thing. There would be no reparations for the generations of unpaid labor. But you know what there would be? The promise of more labor. And even Abraham Lincoln recommended in the Emancipation Proclamation that the formerly enslaved people, quote, in all cases when allowed, labor faithfully for reasonable wages. These quotes come from incredibly important primary sources issued by members of the government and in an official capacity. And it was through these official records that I first, and very briefly, learned about history. And the way I remember it was, I was in US history class one day, and it was probably in February, and my teacher told us to turn to page, 247 or something like that, so that we could learn about the Civil War and its results. And there, in a little pop out on the side of the screen, there was a little box with a picture of Frederick Douglass, talking about him as a great enslaved person, a formerly enslaved person who became free and then became an orator. And there was also another little box that, just below that, about with a kind of a description of enslaved people picking cotton, and a little sketch of what that might have looked like. And so that was slavery. That was really the extent that I learned about it in my US history class. And I loved history. I came from a family that was always talking about the history of slavery. I'm actually going to skip through a couple of these items. So I came from this family that was always talking about history. I'm the youngest of 3, and I've got a big 12-year age gap. And so I grew up in a family that was always telling stories, and many of those stories were about things and people that were long past, that happened before even I was born. And so I really grew up with this feeling that I needed to better understand the past in order to understand my family, understand why they did the things they did and why we lived the places we lived, why we thought certain things were fun, why we stayed away from other places, why my father refuses to go to West Virginia, for example. I mean, he will drive all the way all the way around that state just to get further south because of things that had happened to him and stories he had heard about that state. Same thing with Mississippi. So I was always trying to understand what is going on in our history. And my big frustration was this information wasn't available in my textbooks in school. And when I would talk to my teachers about, can we spend some more time learning about slavery? Like, did it happen just for like 5 seconds right before the Civil War? And then it was over with the Emancipation Proclamation. Like, what led us to that Civil War? What led us to the Emancipation Proclamation? Heck, what led us to the Civil Rights Movement? Why was Rosa Parks forced to leave her seat? There was so much in my public school history classes. And then as my research has continued as an adult, I've seen that this is a pattern all across the country and across generations, that the true context of our nation's history and stories written from the perspectives of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, Black people who were born free, Indigenous people, and all other peoples of color, those stories have been left out. And so it makes me wonder, what are we missing? So these are just some of the questions that came up in my US history class, just kind of popped up in my mind. And then the next year, when I got into my senior year and we had world history. And I remember asking my teacher, the same teacher again, when are we going to learn about African history or Asian history or Latin American history or any other history other than European history and white American history? And in both cases, both when I asked about slavery, when I asked more about information about the civil rights movement, when I asked more about the rest of the world, in both cases, she became deeply uncomfortable, a little awkward, kind of sweaty, and then started coming up with reasons for why we just didn't have enough time in the curriculum or in the semester or in the quarter to actually get to the rest of those stories. And I found that really deeply frustrating because in not talking about those stories, I didn't have the answers I needed to understand why my life was the way why it was, to understand why some of my classmates wouldn't socialize with me in the way that they socialized with white students, in the way that I wondered about why my parents grew up in segregated communities and were adults by the time they finally were able to make real lasting friendships with white Americans. Why we have these statistics about more, especially Black men being in jail than being in college, or more Black men being in jail now than ever existed in slavery. Why? What happened there? What brought us to the era of segregation? What was lynching? What did that do to this country? Why are there family members that I have right now who are still alive who will not talk about some people who were killed in the 1910s and the 1920s? Why are they still terrified to share those stories? What does freedom truly mean? I had a million questions when I graduated from high school. Thankfully, I went on to get my bachelor's degree at Spelman College at Black Women's College in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was learning lessons from a Black and feminist perspective. I was finally getting an opportunity to hear those stories, to get answers to the questions that I had been raising. Because other than my experiences in Spelman, really the only places I could go to get that full history of the country was to go to Afrocentric summer camp every summer, or to ask my parents and ask my siblings what they knew. But because it felt like I could only hear those answers from Black people, I started to wonder, are we just biased? Do we have a completely different way of understanding the world than everyone else? What's going on here? And one of the things that I've had to do as an adult, especially, was ask these questions of the archives. of the collections, of the historic museums and historic houses, of the spaces that we have, we travel by on a day-to-day basis. I've had to start asking a lot of very strategic questions to figure out, why have I not heard these stories? And not just me, but why has there been a lot of scholarship coming out in the last decade that says most people don't know the answers to these questions, and most people aren't hearing them either? Most people don't get a chance to read quotes like this. Your masters who lived in opulence kept you to hard work by some contemptible beings called overseers, who chastised and beat you whenever he pleased, while your master lived in some northern town or in Europe to squander away the wealth only you acquired for him. He never earned a single dollar in his life. You men and women, every one of you around me, made thousands and thousands of dollars for your master. Only you were the means for your masters to lead the ideal and inglorious life, and to give his children the education which he denied to you, for fear you may awake to conscience. So this is a quote. Let me get my notes. So this is a quote from a major in the US colored troops, Martin Delaney. And so this came out, he made this speech to newly freed Black people in South Carolina, just before General Granger's speech, only about a year before. Why wasn't this story one of the stories that I heard? Why wasn't this quote put in conversation with that of the Emancipation Proclamation, so that that I and my fellow students, and so that other Americans could understand that there were Africans and African descendants going back to the 1600s who were demanding freedom, who were recognizing their own intelligence, who were recognizing their own intelligence, and who were recognizing their own worth, and making demands for freedom and equity. So as an adult, as I started wrestling with these questions, after I graduated from Spelman, really one of the first things I started to do was do some real serious genealogical work. I was frustrated that when I kept hearing about US history, especially in museums and in schools, other than my experiences at Spelman, I didn't see myself represented. I didn't see my family represented. I had heard all of these stories about my ancestors who fought in every single major war in the United States history, but I never got to hear what those experiences were really like. I never got to see that primary source documentation. And so I started doing my own family history research. So this tangled and many times erased and re-edited vine that you see on the right side of the screen, that is my family tree. Just my mother's side though. And that little kind of dark spot at the bottom, kind of like a berry, that's me. So this is an artistic representation of my family tree, with each of these vining branches being different members of my family, going all the way back to the 1700s. And so I did this kind of research because I was recognizing that no matter what I did, especially in the museum field, no matter what I did, people were always going to look at me and see me as someone who was different. They were always going to look at me and recognize that there was a story that I was missing from what they had heard. So when I first got into museums, or actually when I first graduated from college and got out into the professional world, I thought I was going to get into international relations. I was going to travel all around the world. I was going to, be the face of America to the rest of the world. That was what I really wanted to do originally. But in my first couple of jobs, I kept being confronted with people recognizing my African ancestry. And even though I had been raised to see that as a positive thing, I kept being made to feel that it wasn't, that it was a negative. And so I have this quote here that I've always really loved from the Caribbeanist thinker, Frantz Fanon. "Oh, my body, make me always a man who questions." I share this with you because no matter where I've gone in my life, in my career, I've always gone as a Black woman. And through doing my family history research, I've come to recognize that there's actually a power in that. That when I look at my body, my facial features, my hands, my feet, my earlobes, I can actually see my ancestors. When you look at these faces here, you can actually start to see them. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a woman named Elizabeth who was born into slavery and then gained her freedom as a very young child. I have a couple of different pictures of her, and she's got a lot of massive, flowing, beautiful, curly hair. And I like to think of she's where I get my beautiful hair DNA from. I've got other ancestors where I can clearly see my eyes, other ancestors where I can clearly see my nose. And that little one in the top right-hand corner, that's my son. And when I look at him on a day-to-day basis, I can see my ancestors in him, and I can also see my husband's ancestors. And so it is with all of this in mind that I do my professional work in museums. I always carry with me on my person and in my heart and in my mind and into my work, my ancestors. And I do it all with the focus on my child and the children all around this country, that they deserve a better version of history than I learned. And so I won't have time for this, but so I want you all to think about quickly just the history of historic houses and museums in this country. That the very first museum in this country was actually created by this group of women here in front of you, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1858. This group of women were enslavers and daughters of enslavers. And they created George Washington's Mount Vernon. They recreated his home. They pulled it from ruin, cleaned it up, and interpreted it in a way to help instill patriotism to all the visitors. But a patriotism that was very white supremacist and focused, which elevated George Washington to an almost Christ-like figure and encouraged us to see him as an individual shorn of all flaws. Slavery, even, was eventually erased from the storytelling at that site. And this was the model for the very first historic houses and museums all across the country. And it's something that we continue to reckon with to this very day. So starting in November of 2019, I became the Director of Interpretation and Education at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I became responsible for advising and in creating a new vision for the stewardship and for the interpretation of historic houses all across the country. We have a portfolio of 27 historic sites that are spread out from Rhode Island to South Carolina, to Texas, to Chicago, to California. And we have in that group, we have a collection of 12 historic sites directly tied to the history of slavery. And interestingly enough, we actually acquired the first 10 of those sites with histories of slavery during the final years of the civil rights movement, in an era when many Americans in our dominant culture were utterly terrified of the changes, especially the racial changes that were occurring in this country. So as our nation was putting up our last wave of Confederate monuments, our organization purchased 10 historic sites with histories of slavery and the Woodrow Wilson House.
Wow.
One of our definitely most white supremacist modern presidents.
Wow. Wow.
So I know I'm running short on time. I just wanted to quickly show a couple of slides of some of the work that I've been doing to help correct that history and that storytelling. So some of that includes doing historical interpretation, dressing as though I'm from different time periods, bringing attention to historic buildings and historic monuments, like this one of Roger B. Toni, who's a fellow Marylander, using some of our nation's founding documents when it comes to the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution to talk about the ways in which those documents hid and erased the history of slavery and made it more difficult for Africans and African Americans to demand their rights. And I've worked with museums in different parts of the country to actually begin the process of repatriating artifacts and cultural heritage objects that were stolen from Africa, Latin American, and a variety of indigenous communities, and put on view and commodified for the American and European tourist public. And one of my favorite things to do, talk about plantation weddings, which is something I'm happy to do in our Q&A. And also to talk about the ways in which our nation's historic sites must move from white supremacist and ethnocentric representations, where, like this picture of Rhett Butler in the corner, we have historic sites that continue to romanticize plantations to the point that they have created white and especially male-centric fantasies of our nation's past, and move those sites toward equitable incorporation, where the stories are told equitably and in collaboration with descendants of slavery and colonization. So I'm gonna leave that here, and I'm so excited to hear the rest of the presentations and to dig into the Q&A, where we continue to talk about our nation's past, our families, our histories, and genetics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elan. What a thought-provoking and just relevant presentation. As I said earlier, I mean, each presenter can, easily have their own standalone webinar, and we definitely have to bring you back so you can share more about your body of literature and research. We're going to go ahead and move on to Daniel. So I'm going to yield the floor to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation as well. Just to make sure you see my screens with no problem.
Yes, we do.
Okay, excellent. So my idea today is to expose you a little bit to what is the science of DNA and how it can be used to find relatives of you. You already know that I actually work for MyHeritage, and MyHeritage is a platform that actually allows you not only to build your family tree, and we have already 80 million of those in our database. Also, we have 14 billion of historical records from around the world, but we have also 5 million DNA kits in our database. The good thing about that is that all those kids are getting matches between themselves. They are also allocated into multiple of the 2,100 plus genetic groups, thanks to the ethnicity estimations, and I'm going to talk about it in just one more minute. And whoever wants to go deeper into that, they can upgrade and get health reports based on your DNA as well. Now, all this is available in 42 languages, and Shari was already mentioning that I am in Israel, and here is the headquarters of the company. But MyHeritage always have considered itself as an international company, and we have people from all over the world. And specifically about the DNA, we launched it in November 2016. And since then, we have been improving our technology and our resource every time. We have tested thousands of people that are tested daily. Mostly are MyHeritage kits users, meaning people that have bought and test on MyHeritage, but we also like and welcome uploads. And I will explain that in one more second. What you and everybody else is going to get with the DNA test is both the DNA matches and the ethnicity estimation. One point that worth mentioning is that MyHeritage offers, if you decide to buy a DNA kit with us, the easiest way to collect DNA is just a cheek swab. You don't need a blood test. You don't need any herding procedure. You also don't need to spit on any receipt, because we understand that for some people that may be a little bit difficult, especially if you're testing your oldest relatives. So based on that, and I would like to emphasize, I am not from the sales department, I'm actually a genealogist. I will encourage everybody to take a DNA test, but I understand that probably you already did that in other companies out there. And it's perfectly fine. And I'm actually not going to tell you to buy another kit, but to save a few bucks by uploading your digital results from whatever of those companies out there into MyHeritage, and you're going to get exactly the same benefits of everybody testing or buying a MyHeritage kit. Now, let me go now a little bit deep into the DNA and what it is and what it stands for. First of all, clarification. We all have 23 pairs of chromosomes. It doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your color, it doesn't matter even where in the world you are. Human being has 23 pairs of chromosomes, and that may ring bells for the name of another company out there that dedicates to this 23andMe. So this is where the name is coming out from. Now, all this DNA is material that was inherited, meaning it came from your ancestors. You're carrying with you a piece of their life and their material. Those 23 pairs of chromosomes, you can start by selecting them into different areas. One of them, one pair, is actually dedicated exclusively to determine the gender of the person. This is what it's called the Y and the X chromosomes. If you have an X and a Y, you are going to be biological defined as a male. If you have two X's, then you will be a female. And I will need to say that there are DNA tests that concentrate in those two or in that pair of chromosomes. You could do a Y DNA test, you could do an X or an MT DNA test. MyHeritage and most of the other companies out there actually looked at the other 22 pairs of chromosome to the rest of the information. So we take out from that sample that only specific pair, and we take all the other 22 pairs. The reason for that, and this is called the autosomal DNA, and of course you don't need to know that by heart, but you need to understand why the importance of this type of test, because as you can see here in the graphic, and I will keep explaining as the presentation goes, with your DNA, you can see that you're carrying little pieces of your ancestors. And it doesn't matter if they were females or males, if they're coming from your paternal or your maternal side, all of them are inside of you. So how do you get your DNA? Well, obviously from your parents, at least from your biological parents. And you are getting 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% of your father. In other words, each pair comes, one of those pairs from one side of the pair comes from the mother and the other one comes from the father. And you are also going to give your children 50% of their DNA, okay? And you are also sharing with your brothers and sisters 50% of the DNA. If we move across our family tree, you will notice that the DNA goes always in half, meaning that you're sharing 25% of your DNA with each of your 4 grandparents, but also with whatever niece, nephews, or granddaughters and grandsons that you may have. 12.5% with great grandfathers, and 6.25% with first cousins once removed, and it doesn't matter if they are on top or below your generation. So this is very useful whenever you are getting your results to understand the distance, the relationship that you have with those matches. And you need to take in account both the age of the person and the percentage of DNA that you are sharing with this other person. Now, DNA goes 10 generations back, because if you keep going in a straight line up your family tree, you will see that when you get to the 10th generation, you already lose all the DNA from those ancestors. Now, this is correct. And first of all, the sign before the numbers are it's very important, because this is approximately, okay, more or less. And I like to talk about percentages, but some other people will talk about centimorgans, and that is the amount of DNA that you're sharing, and it's exactly the same. I just think it's easier to understand by talking about percentages. Now, this is true for the quantity of DNA that you have and you share with other people. When you're talking about ethnicity, it's a little bit different than just the quantity. And let me explain you that, taking in account Mike's family. Mike's has a mother. He also have grandparents and great-grandparents. Now, all 4 great-grandparents of Mike are coming from purple land, meaning that the grandparents are going to be 100% purple, and Mike's mom is also going to be 100% purple. That will make Mike 50% purple. Remember that Mike takes 50% of the DNA from the mother and another 50% from your father. So if you said 50%, good for you, you have been paying attention. Now, Mike also has a father, and the father has parents and grandparents. Now, the father's side of Mike, it's a little bit more colorful, because one great-grandfather is coming from blue land, another one is coming from red county, and another couple is coming from orange county. Now, that means that the grandparents of Mike is going to be half blue and half red, and still 100% orange, while the dad is going to be half orange, a quarter red, and a quarter blue. And with all that information, we now should understand that Mike should be 25% orange, 12.5% blue, and 12.5% red. And if we now take this color for family and we assign different areas of the world to each color, you will understand that Mike is actually 50% Ashkenazi Jew, 25% Iberian, 12.5 West African, and 12.5 Native American. And this will be great if the ethnicity will go together with the quantity of DNA that Mike is getting. But unfortunately, this is not always the case and not always perfect. Or in other words, why are my ancestors' origins not reflected in my ethnicity? Or why are so many white people out there astonished when they learn that they have Black DNA? And let me explain you how this is possible. We have here one person, and I have decided to color the DNA of the person half blue and half purple. And I'm gonna marry this person with an 100% orange individual. Now, you already know that the child will have 0.5% of its DNA from each one. And that is going to be the case. The only problem is that the child will not take exactly 50% of the ethnicity from the parents. In this case, of course, one of the parents is 100% yellow, so it has no other option to take but 50% yellow. But from the other parent, which was half purple and half blue, it took 50% of that DNA, but it took more purple than blue, and it's now 33.4% purple and 16% blue. this child is going to be married, and just to keep things simple, I decided to take another person 100% gray. Now their child is going to be 33% yellow, 16% blue, 50% green, and 0% purple. Now, again, you can check my numbers. The child is taking 50% of the DNA from the father and 50% of the DNA from the mother. So what we can learn here? Well, you can see that the yellow ethnicity is way higher than expected. If we go by the rule, it should be 25%, but in this case, it's 33.3. The blue ethnicity remains exactly the same after 2 generations. And that explains how the ethnicities may travel along more than 10 generations and just by chance not losing them across time. And of course, the purple ethnicity is gone in just a couple of generations. And unfortunately, all this shows that the DNA is totally random. But how we can define your ethnicity? How can we know what your DNA brings? And this is because we have what we call the founders population. We took a sample of people, not only that were happy to give their DNA, but also to share their genealogy research. And we knew for sure that all 4 grandparents were having ancestors in that same country or that same area of the world. And when we compare your DNA to their DNA, we can say what percentage of your DNA belongs to each region. Up to just a few months ago, we had some amount of regions, but as the database grows and the technology gets better, now we are able to identify different regions in that same ethnicity. And this is what we call genetic groups. And now we're able to tell you not only what ethnicity you are, but also the exact locations where your ancestors are coming. You will be able to see the samples of data that we have taken, the numbers. You will be able to see also the common names, surnames, given names, places in other people's family tree. And you will also be able to see, thanks to the mix of DNA and family trees, the movement of those ancestors through the world. And that will explain why maybe you have certain ethnicity on your DNA, but your family never was in that country or never came from that area. Well, because some ancestors far more than 10 generations back were coming also from different places, but they share their DNA. Now, why I insist always to upload a family tree with your DNA, because at least on MyHeritage, you will have the opportunity to overlap that genealogical information with the DNA. And if you build the family tree and you do your genealogy as you should, you will notice how things actually matches. And here is where people realize that it doesn't matter what they heard in their family. It doesn't matter what color of the skin they have ancestors that actually are related to those origins. And we all have the same DNA in our bodies, and we share the DNA of our ancestors, which were actually the same for all the humanity. So I hope that with this, I clarify a little bit how you can use your DNA to find ancestors, to find DNA matches people out there, and hopefully to clarify also where your ethnicity is coming from.
Daniel, wow, thank you so much. I never really understood the science, behind, DNA testing. And I have to say, I've been curious about it. So now I really want to take a deeper dive. So thank you so much for your very scientific and informative presentation. It was quite informative. We are really running short on time because we started a few minutes late. So Daniel, I see you have one question, but we're not going to really have time to entertain it. So I really hope that you'll be able to,
I'm going to do
come
my
back and
best to
join
come
us.
back.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes,
thank
yes.
you so much. We're going to move on to Sherman. So I'm going to yield the floor to you, Sherman.
Hey, how's it going? Appreciate you inviting me on the panel today to discuss African American genetics and testing, and to kind of see where it's going, where it's at, and kind of like where it's going. And so I'll kind of get started. I know we're short on time. I think my question was, kind of discussing how information from Y-DNA testing is changing the perceptions of family and lineage for African Americans, and to discuss how the science is changing as well. And so um, I believe that testing has really started to broaden the scope of family, largely because of the institution of slavery and the impact that it's had on Africans and people of the diaspora. In many cases, records have disappeared, but it's that genetic data that remains intact that ultimately allows us to trace our lineage back a bit further. I never would have thought that taking a DNA test, I would just come back with these thousands of matches, because my concept of family was different at the time, immediate. And so it really changed my whole concept when I started to see these thousands of matches. But as I started to delve further back, I started to pick up loads of matches from like Africa, different places in Africa. I think up to date, I've tested a lot of family. I probably control over 100 kids, but I've tested a lot of family members. So I probably picked up and detected about 50 to 60 continental African matches, and some other people of the diaspora, like Haitians, people from Honduras, and some of them are like third or fourth cousins with my grandmother, and some other people are family. And so we are often just kind of amazed as to how we're related, and we are constantly trying to figure this puzzle out. But autosomal testing or DNA testing is really allowing us to piece that puzzle back together. um, because and even some of the research that has been shown is now being proven. I mean, we had about roughly 388,000 Africans shipped into the United States. They ultimately banned the importation of Africans, and that's when breeding started to pick up, because plantation owners were trying to offset their losses, of course. And so our DNA test actually shows the effects of breeding. I have a preponderance of evidence that my fifth great grandfather, his name is Washington Ratliff, he was born roughly 1800, 1805, was a breeder. When I first got started with DNA or genealogy, I found maybe 6 or 7 kids he had with his first wife. But years later, through records and DNA, I've located close to 30 kids of his. And because of the age gaps, I'm pretty sure he has more kids out there. And so there's matches that descending from him that, they're come from Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, further into the deep South. So testing is actually revealing that. And it's also showing, the effects of the second Middle Passage, whereas 1 to 2 million Africans who were displaced from the upper South to the lower South during the time cotton started to become king, as they say. And so those were our relatives, being forced to march from Virginia and North Carolina, sometimes in caggles, all the way to Alabama and Mississippi. So we still share genetic data with their descendants. So it's really a beautiful thing to take a DNA test, and I find these matches from the deep South. And quite often, or sometimes, I'm actually able to triangulate our connection back to, my ancestral line from North Carolina, et cetera. So I have other friends who were able to, find their direct African ancestor, the person that came over directly from Africa. So the testing is really allowing us to do a lot of things and advance our genealogy from our tormented and often tumultuous past. And also the testing, of course, reveals, we still share the genetic data with people that might enslaved or, had their way with some of our family. And so testing now shows that it wasn't always a slave master who impregnated our ancestors. It could have been the kid, the grandkid, the son, the neighbor, the overseer. And so because we still share genetic data, we're now able to kind of use those random bits and pieces of DNA and kind of tie that back to our common ancestors. So it's really been a good thing what DNA testing is doing for us. And so um, it should be kind of interesting to see where it goes in the future. I won't talk too much about autosomal DNA. Daniel spoke on that a bit, but autosomal DNA is the test that most people start off with. Because it's looking at the DNA that you inherit from both sides, and you get more information back because you're getting more, you get matches back from both sides. We often have to keep in mind that I think we have 16 second great grandparents, 32 thirds. It just keeps doubling. So we inherit random bits of DNA from those ancestors, often broken down and recombined. And it's up to us to kind of do the detective work to figure that out. And so although I feel like ethnicity is an estimate, it can start to render some clues. And of course, as DNA companies start to get more information, more reference samples, we're going to be able to actually be even more precise with determining ethnicity estimates and things like that, because it also shows some hidden jewels as well. I think a lot of African Americans, we were often told that we had a Native American great grandmother or somewhere down the line, and DNA testing can confirm or deny that in a lot of cases. Although DNA, if it's so far back, it could wash out eventually because it's recombined. And so, there's been loads of African Americans that, took a DNA test and found out they have Malagasy ancestry, an ancestor that was, come from Madagascar and ends up in the United States. And so, where the testing is going is like really a good thing. And so I always recommend, because African Americans as a whole, we're largely underrepresented in DNA databases, but the field for African American genealogists is just booming. So I often tell people to send these companies your feedback, let them know what you want, so they can start catering some of their products to us. In a sense. And so like my company, for example, Family Tree DNA, we did our recent update for our ethnicity estimates. And so I think we had roughly 4 African populations. So now we're at 24 African populations. So that puts us, so we either exceed or on par with the other DNA testing companies. And so with more people testing, so I really think what I try to promote with, so it's a good thing to have people doing DNA tests, but they really should probably learn the advanced genealogy techniques, how to do chromosome mapping, how to read a chromosome browser, genome mapping, and using sites like DNA Painter. It really allows us to start to learn more about triangulation. And so once we learn how to triangulate those segments, those shared segments that we have with matches back to a common ancestor, then we're really able to get even further back with our matches and start picking up more distant matches or even confirming them. So often, so I believe that, so it's a great thing to have so many people doing DNA tests, especially with autosomal, but we can get much further back and make more connections once people start building out their trees and actually learning advanced genealogy techniques. That way you can look at that, you can figure out what a third cousin twice removed is, or a first cousin 3 times removed based off the amount of shared DNA you have. And so that saves you time, and it actually allows you to get much, much further back. So overall, I'm kind of pleased with how testing is going. I feel like there's still a disconnect between, African Americans and a genetic genealogy community as a whole. And so hopefully, I can see over the next couple of years, hopefully DNA testing companies continue to improve their products. And I hope African Americans as a whole start to write these companies and let them know how they, let them know what they want. If I feel like sometimes if we don't let people know what we want, we're not always going to get it. And so I always advocate for people to contact the companies and just kind of let them know about the products. And so Family Tree DNA also is the only company that essentially tests all 3 types of DNA. And so I'll touch on mtDNA briefly. mtDNA is the DNA that a mother would pass down to her kids, but only women will continuously pass it down. So essentially, it's only continuously passed down to women. And so it's not the best for genealogy. It's more of a deep ancestral test. That's because the mtDNA mutates a bit slowly, so it's really hard to figure out your connection with somebody. You can have a perfect match and that person might be related to you, 500, 600 years ago. And without tumultuous past, really to have a person matching us 500 years ago doesn't always gives the best information. But it does answer a lot of questions as well. Maybe you have a question, you want to know where your ancestry arises. It gives you a haplogroup. A haplogroup shows the path that your ancestors might have took migrating in and around Africa, or out of Africa. And so there's mutations that happen over the course of time with them traveling. So that's what scientists are able to map out, the mutations. And that's how the haplogroup starts to change over the course of time. And so there's like 3 levels to mtDNA. You have your HBR1, HBR2, and the coding region. The coding region is the part of the DNA that, it looks at the genes as well. So if you can get a match on a coding region, a good match, it's possible you might be able to trace it back. And so if you have questions about, if your distant grandmother was Native American, well, your haplogroup will show you if they have a Native American haplogroup or not. My haplogroup is like L2C. So research shows that it's found among the Mende and the Timne people from Sierra Leone and also in Senegambia. And so science, they're able to glean more and more information. So I know my company, for one, has started a project, a Million Mito project, where they're trying to get citizen scientists, other genealogists to actually start getting their DNA tested a bit more, because mtDNA has been neglected. And of course, as African Americans, we've always been underrepresented in genetic databases. So, but that's what we need to do, is actually be more proactive in getting into advanced DNA testing, just to get it out there and start. And so we'll be able to ultimately fill in some of those genetic gaps that are existing. Um, and so I'll finish up talking about why DNA. That's really what I work with every day now. When I started working for the company, it was mostly, dealing with autosomal, but I kind of moved into a different position where most of my work just involves solely about the Y chromosome, and that's the DNA that the father passes on to his kids. So essentially, you're looking at that test. If you do receive any matches, they're going to be related to you along your direct paternal line. Y'all going to share a common grandfather at some point in time, and so the Y DNA shows you, kind of similar to the mtDNA, your haplogroup assignment, where your origins are. And you can be really up for surprises. It's actually a great genealogy tool as well. I've solved a couple cases using Y-DNA. One, I thought my third great grandfather was the offspring of an enslaver. So I tested my first cousin 3 times removed, and his haplogroup came back with a surprise. It was African, but not only African, we were at the root of the phylogenetic tree. Essentially, um, Adam, genetic Y chromosome Adam had 2 kids, and we descend from one of them. So it was really interesting to find that my DNA from my second great grandfather goes back to some of the first archaic humans that ever walked the earth. And so we are able to glean some surprises like that. But as the science starts to advance with Y-DNA, we're more into SNP testing. So my company has a test that's really thorough. It's called a big Y test, and it looks at about 70 or 80% of the Y chromosome. So not only does it look at what they call the STRs, it looks at SNPs. I think they call that single nucleopolymorphism. Pretty much is essentially a unique point of DNA inherited from a common ancestor. So it actually provides more accuracy than the old style of regular Y-DNA testing using STRs. So now, because of the advances with SNP testing, we're now able to better predict your connection with the match. So we know that if we're looking at 2 big Y testers, and that block, say you have you share 3 private variants, so we just do the calculation. SNPs mutate on average of 80 to 120 years. You guys share 3 on average, so we know that you are related with, at least within the last 200 to 300 years. But even more so, Our scientists have now begun excavating, old bones and that have been found, and they've been running DNA analysis on them, and so that's been really interesting as well. Once they upload that, our phylogeneticist does an analysis, and I've reached out to numerous matches who descend from some of the first Africans that come here, and I reached out to them. But I'm going to be wrapping up soon, and I just want to say that why DNA is really taking edge. But before I leave, I think African Americans really need to start doing their due diligence on like testing companies and things of that nature, because there is no test out there that can predict a tribe. It's just not that specific. And so I can't spend too much time on that. Maybe someone asks me a question, but if you're taking a test and someone's telling you you're from XYZ tribe, that's going to be factually incorrect, because they don't have enough genetic data to actually make those kind of predictions. And so definitely I would advocate that, of course, that African Americans contact DNA testing companies and let them know their recommendations on how they feel about where it's going, and as well as do your due diligence before you spend hundreds of dollars for a test that's not really helping you out with genealogy. And so I really appreciate you having me on, and I'll pass this back over.
Thank you so much, Sherman. Once again, we need part two of this, because I just think, each presenter, each panelist could take a deeper dive. So we're at 11:10 and we have one more presenter. So we're definitely we're eating into our Q&A time. And so I do ask our panelists that have gone so far, if you can look at the chat, and if you can maybe respond to some of the chat questions, because we are eating into, we definitely are eating into our Q&A time. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Reynaldo. I yield the floor to you.
Good morning from St. Louis. As I've been listening to all of this great scientific information, I'm thinking of the politics of it and how it's communicated. For example, the science is great, but now when we live in this era of what people call fake news, and we can't even get a large swath of the American population to use vaccines, to protect them in the midst of this pandemic. That's where this clash between narratives and science come into play. Right now, you could say in this country, because we're talking about this presentation in DNA in relation to narratives, there are roughly 4 competing narratives in terms of what is operative in America right now. And as George Packer wrote in a recent essay in the Atlantic, he talks about you're dealing with free America, or this idea of a libertarian spirit in terms of personal freedom or freedom without being bothered by anyone. Second, I would say you have what you call smart America, those people that believe in meritocracy, somebody like a Bill Gates. Then third, you have a real America, these people that are represented by people like a Sarah Palin, a Donald Trump, Christian evangelicalism. And then you have a just America, those people I guess you would consider the woke generation with their various ideological perspectives. And these 4 narratives are all going to influence how they react or interact with what technology, science, and DNA. Now, historically, when we think of DNA and genetics, as one of the two of the previous speakers have alluded to, it revolves around scientific racism or eugenics at a worse end of it in terms of the early 20th century, due to the plantocracy that you had in this country. And then in the early 20th century, when they had what was called scientific racism, which was operative here in the Western industrialized societies. However, recently, an excellent book that I reference people to read when you think of what the politics of this DNA would be, Alondra Nelson's book, The Social Life of DNA, where it talks about, because of the revolutions in science, people now can trace their ancestry. Now, in terms of my own family, we were simply through records the last couple of decades, we were able to trace our family heritage back to an African-American woman born in 1830. And then beyond that, we had some genetic testing based upon her matrilineal line, and we roughly end up in the area of Cameroon and West Africa. However, these DNA testings, as Dr. Nelson alludes to, have led to further discussions around the idea of possible reparations and some other issues. All right. But however, the other dark side of DNA testing in the politics is now you have people that are politically connected to the alt-right and some of the people who want to establish this type of ancestry to Nordic countries and connect the ideology of white supremacy to this Nordic past. And then finally, because I know we're short on time and we want to get to questions, the last point I want to raise is because I'm known primarily in my scholarship as an Afrofuturist scholar. So what now we're looking at in Afrofuturist studies, we're looking at DNA in terms of human enhancement, in terms of how that's going to play out over the next 20 years around concepts related to Ray Kurzweil's concept of the singularity, or this idea of enhancement in terms of military science. For instance, at the end, the second part of the Obama administration, the American military had the Talos Project, which talks about this exoskeleton armor for soldiers on future battlefields. Also, recently, the French military and government is talking about human enhancement in DNA and genetic augmentation in relation to also attributions related to military science and future battlefield and in relation to DNA. Also, the other thing is what you're seeing a lot now, even is coming out in our science fiction and our writing now, this relationship between genetic testing, DNA, and what does it mean to, we're moving towards some kind of concept of post-humanity. For example, we've talked about slavery and civil rights and human rights, but in the next few decades, what is it going to mean if based upon the acceleration of technology, nanotechnology and biotech revolution, if you're able to download a person's consciousness into some type of an advanced AI. Right now, there's discussions now, if we get that ability where your consciousness can be removed from your body, will these collective consciousness that have been uploaded require some civil rights for them to be protected from being exploited? So what this DNA revolution that is leading to now, the science is clearly outracing our ethics, because the biotech revolution is, while we're at the same time, I would say this conversation we're having is primarily taking place in like what those narratives that I brought about earlier, Smart America. 3 of those other narratives might reject those, the discussion we're having based upon certain ideological preferences in terms of how it might be used. For example, there are communities who believe that the vaccine, that because of it came to the market too quick, they think it's going to have something that's going to impact their DNA. Okay, and then there are other people who are acting violently because they believe that the wearing of a mask violates their personal liberty or their rights. So the problem we have with these 4 competing narratives in the country and in relation to DNA science, social change is happening faster than the ability of many Americans to adapt. And so therefore, we're going to have certain reactions to this information, which will be uninformed. And so this political conflict will go on for some time around the politics of DNA, genomic sequencing, and the future of science here in this, in the country. And since I know we're short on time, I'll stop right there, and I'll be happy to address any questions related to anything that I've said.
Thank you. Tasking, managing this chat that is blowing up. Okay, so We're at 11:18. We can do 10 minutes of Q&A, which may mean each panelist can take a question. I do ask the panelists to be succinct. There's one question that that I'm going to combine that I think Daniel and or Sherman, either one of you can respond to this question. Let me find it in the chat. So I had it. Oh. Okay, so I think this is for Daniel. Daniel, are you still with us? Okay. So maybe you can address this question, Sherman, if Daniel's not with us. So it talked about, I guess there was a 60 Minutes episode regarding what happens to your bio data after you pay for a genealogy test. Are people who purchase and use these kits being exploited, data minded? If so, how? So
yeah, there's been a lot of debate about that. As far as I'm aware, like my company, they will store your DNA for up to 20 years, but it's only used for, we have upgrades. So someone might want to purchase a 12 marker test and they might come back 5 or 10 years later and do an upgrade, or maybe they're deceased, or maybe they died and a relative wants to upgrade that DNA test. And so we use it for that purpose only. But if a customer wrote us and asked us to destroy their DNA, we'll do it. So sometimes we do have customers that order a test and they'll send us a message: after you process this, just throw all my DNA away. And so, yeah, we'll let them do that. And so I've heard stories about that, but as far as I know, I don't really know any specific examples, offhand, but I hear about that a lot. And so I just know from my experience, if a customer asks us to do something with their DNA, we do it, destroy it.
okay, thank you. Elon, this question is for you. How old were you when you started questioning your history teachers?
So that is a pretty good question. My way of answering that is to really kind of, number one, think about the way I was raised up. And I was really raised in a family that was always asking a lot of questions, always talking. And we had a lot of transparency, especially when it came to family stories, even the more challenging, more difficult, hard to hear stories. So I just thought that's how everybody's families were. I thought everybody was just open and sharing and talking about stuff. And, as I started doing family history research and also like questioning my teachers, I started realizing that there are certain questions, certain topics that people don't want to talk about, or maybe they'll talk about it with you, but only in a small group or in a one-on-one conversation. And so, I've probably been questioning teachers since elementary school, since my racial memories go back that far, since at least first grade. But I also was very early on getting that pushback of, yeah, we don't talk about that. Oh, that's a taboo. So I recognize that it's something that makes people uncomfortable, but that these are necessary questions and necessary stories to address. So I just keep questioning no matter what.
Thank you. And that's, I think, good advice for all of us, right? Reynaldo, thank you for being so succinct, which you gave us back a couple of minutes, and we appreciate that. You talked about post-humanity, based on biotech and nanotech technology and AI technology, and how science is outpacing our moral ethics. As consumers, any advice, recommendation, or how can we become more either protective or more informed and knowledgeable in a way that protects us as consumers?
Consumers,
and you have to answer that in 60 seconds or less, right? No,
okay, I operate off of the assumption that most people are not rational, okay? That they basically respond to their emotions rather than logic. So I would say, like, right now in Afrofuturist studies, a lot of people are looking at Octavia Butler's work in terms of what that means in terms of ethics. and the idea of the post-human. And so, like I said, there are people because that believe that, oh, this is my personal choice or whatever, and they feel like their own personal ethics, they should be able to augment themselves as they please, because that is their right, and then there are other people that disagree with that. And so on a very basic level in terms of augmentation, DNA and so forth. And this is going to lead to a clash. For example, even in religious communities, what is a soul? Of a person, if they get augmented or whatever, are they still a human being and deserve, salvation? So this is going to bring in very core ethical, philosophical questions about what it means to be a human. And the other aspect of it is when we're talking about how we come at this stuff, as I was listening to Elon's talk, we're dealing with alternative geographies of reason. For African Americans, our geography of reason comes primarily out of West Africa and the Middle Passage. And that conflicts with the geography of reason as we're taught to understand reason in schools that comes from Europe and the Enlightenment. Because there's a contradiction between the Enlightenment and in slavery, at the core of American society. And that conflict is going to, as I said, we're kind of at these 4 different narratives at the moment out of that contradiction. And that contradiction is then going to influence our consumer choices and then how we what kind of communities of interest that we're going to socialize with.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for addressing that so succinctly. And so I'm going to pose this last question to any of our panelists. Please explain what is meant in, but it does, Sherman, you touched on this in your presentation. Please explain what is meant in historic slave breeding and breeders.
Oh, you want me to? Okay. Yeah, I mean, as after slavery, they banned the importation of slavery, so the plantation owners need to still make money. So that's when breeding practices picked up, where the enslaved men and women, they were forced to pretty much have kids. That was almost their job, to have as many kids as possible. And I've heard stories about men being rented out, going to various plantations, and they were studs. Essentially, that's what they were looked at. And so that happens a lot. And so sometimes we see that within our matches. That's why when you start to get better understanding of DNA and how to triangulate, you'll see loads of matches that might all lend back to maybe a 3rd or 4th great grandparent. It's just like, wow, how can these 40, 50 people all tie back to, this ancestral couple or this man? And so you start to see that it's not always apparent to the naked eye, but once you start looking through your matches in common, and you can start to glean some clues as to, if an ancestor was a breeder or not. And so that's just what they was used for.
Thank you. Elon, Reynaldo, any closing remarks?
I would say that because what's happening in the country right now, in light of what happened on January 6th, these narratives I was talking about, I think a lot of this stuff is going to come to a head over the next couple of years. The way I can make sense of it now is it seems like, and this, you have to go back beyond the 1960s. I know you all are in New Hampshire. Out here, in terms of the cultural geography, it's looking like it's getting ready to be a conflict between the North and the South again. New England versus the South again in the Confederacy around a lot of these issues of human rights and the future. But the thing is, it depends on how much people kind of care about the country and the future of science and so forth. Because that's why it's kind of like, I told a friend yesterday, kind of like now the narrative is now you're trying to get a element of the population to buy in, but it's like you're selling them Blockbuster when they know they should be switching to Netflix. And so the politics and the ethical considerations that needed to be debated are like in the Blockbuster stage, and no one wants to politically deal with the ramifications of Netflix. And so because people are not being educated and informed fast enough, to make sound ethical conditions because they don't know what's true or not.
Okay, thank you. Elon, if you could just really take 1 minute.
So I really just want to make sure that everyone is continuing to think about, the power of that storytelling and who gets to tell these stories. Like I said, I work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and one of our historic sites, James Madison's Montpelier in Orange, Virginia, had a massively historically important vote this past Wednesday, where the foundation of the board of the Montpelier Foundation voted to give equitable stewardship of the historic site with descendants of slavery. This is the first and only time this has ever happened in the United States of a historic site, especially a presidential historic site. It's been all over the news. Check out the Washington Post articles. It's on their website now. But it is incredibly, incredibly important that we think about who is telling these stories and how we can better empower the stories and the perspectives of descendants of slavery and indigenous peoples in this country, to be able to tell our own stories for the first time, and to actually do it through our DNA, through our family history, through all of these different avenues. It's just incredibly important. And I encourage you all to keep telling those stories within your families.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our illustrious panelists. You all were just amazing, and such a dynamic and stimulating and provocative discussion, as I knew it would be. We are out of time. I'm going to turn it over to Allison to literally do closing remarks.
Thank you all. And I have been watching, and our participant numbers have stayed the same and gone up. So thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you, Dr. Robinson, for your very skillful facilitation. We are, again, so appreciative of all of you. And just like we could have a session on each one of these topics, I could probably have an entire session myself on my own reflections. I'm not going to take much time, but I do want to just offer one piece of reflection of mine from all of the panelists today. And again, as a white person, I just keep being reminded of what privilege means for me. And Sherman, when you named that our DNA systems don't even have great representation of Black community, like that's just something that doesn't exist for me, something that doesn't register for me. And so, but what I've come to learn, that privilege for me is just that this is the space where I need to have more intentional thinking. And so I hope every single one of us, especially those of us who identify as white, we walk away from this knowing that we didn't control the fact that our databases don't have strong representation, but we all have the power to change that, and we have the power to name that, and we have the power for more intentional thought going forward, so that we can not only have Juneteenth be a federal holiday, but we can, as Elon noted, we can make sure that our faces are reflected in all of our history books. We are at a very pivotal time in our nation and here in the state around efforts to suppress continued engagement and learning. And I don't know, just Elon's presentation reminding us that we do have a choice. We have a different way of going forward, and the Black Heritage Trail is a key part of that. We hope you can donate to us. We hope you can join us at our event at 3 p.m. at the Burying Ground for an amazing in-person drumming. And I'd like to just end with a big thanks again to our sponsors, and thank you. And we hope to see you all again this afternoon, and hopefully also on our July 3rd Frederick Douglass reading, which is at noon time. And Jerian, if you have more to say about that. All right, you guys.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope you will respond as quick to our survey. We have some prizes going out for responding to the survey. I too thank our panelists. And as our moderator said, this session could be a lot longer, but it gives us moment for pause and to think, especially when we think about both sides of the coin, the good and bad of the science that we're moving towards. The science itself, it's not bad or good, it's just how we use it. So we thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the Burying Ground if you're joining us. And hopefully we can have you all back again for a deeper dive into this discussion. Thank you all so much. Have a good one.